The courtroom was crowded long before the judge entered. People lined the benches, reporters adjusted microphones, cameras waited in silence. Lawyers shuffled papers that had already been read 100 times. There was a strange energy in the room, a feeling that something larger than an ordinary criminal case was about to unfold. This was not just another trial, it was becoming a national spectacle, and at the center of it all sat a man who did not look like the monster many expected. He wore a suit, his hair was neat. He spoke clearly, he smiled at times. He looked more like a young professional than a man accused of terrible violence. That contrast would become one of the most disturbing parts of the story. His name was Ted Bundy. To understand why the trials of Ted Bundy captured the country, we have to go back before the cameras, before the courtroom drama, before the strange decision to act as his own lawyer. We have to return to the years when fear first began to spread across several American states, carried not by headlines at first, but by whispers. In the early 1970s, young women began disappearing. Some vanished from college campuses, some were last seen walking to classes, libraries, or parking lots. Others disappeared after ordinary afternoons that should have ended in routine ways. A trip to the store, a walk across campus, a day at the lake, then they were gone. At first, the cases seemed separate, different towns, different police departments, different circumstances. There was no easy reason to connect them. Missing persons cases were often difficult and confusing. Adults could leave by choice, witnesses forgot details, leads went cold. But patterns began to emerge. Many victims were young, many were students, several had similar appearances, and witnesses in different places described a polite man approaching women in public. Sometimes he wore a cast or sling, sometimes he asked for help loading something into a car. He seemed injured, harmless, even charming. That was the trap. The man used manners as camouflage. It is hard to explain now just how unusual the public image of a serial killer was at that time. Many people imagined danger as something obvious. They expected evil to look wild, threatening, rough, or unstable. Bundy challenged that belief in the most chilling way possible. He appeared normal, more than normal. He could appear likable. And that made the fear deeper. Investigators in states like Washington, Utah, Colorado, and others slowly began comparing notes. Detectives who had once worked separate cases started seeing familiar details. Similar victim profiles, similar methods, similar disappearances. The work was slow. This was an era before instant databases, before modern digital case sharing, before surveillance cameras on every corner and smartphones in every pocket. Information moved through phone calls, mailed files, meetings, memory, and persistence. Detectives had to build bridges between jurisdictions, one conversation at a time. Some officers believed one man was moving across state lines, some were not yet convinced. Meanwhile, the suspect continued moving through ordinary life. Ted Bundy had attended college. He had relationships, he volunteered in politics, he presented himself as intelligent and ambitious. To outsiders, he looked like someone building a future. To investigators, he was becoming something else entirely, a shadow moving through multiple unsolved disappearances. Then came one of the most important clues. Witnesses at a crowded recreational area near Seattle reported seeing a man speak with women. He introduced himself as Ted. He asked for help with a sailboat. He drove a Volkswagen Beetle. The name was common, the car was common, but it was enough to start narrowing possibilities. Soon, investigators received tips about a man named Ted Bundy. Even then, nothing was simple. He was educated, articulate, calm under pressure. He did not fit the image many expected. That mismatch caused hesitation. Could this polished young man truly be linked to such crimes? History shows us again and again that appearances can mislead, but in real time, people struggle with that truth. As suspicion grew, Bundy relocated, studied law, and kept adapting. He seemed fascinated by authority, rules, and systems. He watched how institutions worked. He learned how people responded to confidence. He studied the language of respectability. These traits would later explode into public view during his trials, because Ted Bundy would not behave like most defendants. He would challenge witnesses, question procedure. Speak directly to the court, smile at cameras, correct details, demand control. And perhaps most strangely of all, he would often seem to enjoy the stage, but before that theater came arrest. In 1975, a patrol officer in Utah stopped Bundy during the night. Something about the vehicle and the driver seemed suspicious. Inside the car were items that raised immediate concern, objects that could be linked to burglary or restraint. It was not yet the dramatic capture many imagine from films. It was a routine police encounter that slowly opened a much darker door. The stop led to deeper scrutiny. Witnesses identified him in relation to earlier incidents. Investigators looked again at disappearances and assaults. The web tightened. Yet even then, Bundy continued projecting calm intelligence. He spoke with confidence. He believed, or at least acted as if he believed, he could outthink the system around him. That confidence became central to everything that followed. As prosecutors prepared cases, the media took notice. Here was a suspect accused in multiple crimes across states. Here was a defendant who did not look like the public expected. Here was a story involving psychology, mystery, and the growing realization that one of America's most notorious killers might have hidden behind a clean smile and polished words. Television wanted in. The 1970s were a changing era for media. News was becoming more immediate, more visual, more national. A courtroom could become a stage scene far beyond the people sitting inside it, and Bundy understood cameras almost as quickly as reporters did. He knew where they were, he knew when to turn. He knew how to speak in complete, memorable sentences. This would disturb many observers later. Some felt he treated proceedings like performance. Others believed the performance was part of his deeper psychology, a need for attention, control, admiration, and intellectual combat. But none of that erased the facts investigators were building. Behind the polished image were grieving families, missing daughters, shattered communities, and years of fear. Behind every headline was someone whose life had been interrupted forever. That tension between spectacle and tragedy would define the trials, because the more famous Bundy became, the easier it was for some viewers to focus on him instead of those harmed by him. In court, this conflict would become visible every day. Was he a brilliant manipulator or simply a man desperate to maintain power? Was his confidence real or collapsing? Was the courtroom his final refuge? The legal battles ahead would test not only evidence, but the limits of public fascination itself. And soon, the nation would watch something rare and unsettling. A murdered defendant stepping forward to help run his own defense. Turning cross-examination into theater and trial procedure into a psychological contest. But before the cameras rolled in full force, before the judge called the room to order, and before Ted Bundy tried to place himself at the center of the drama, there was another shocking twist waiting in the shadows. He had not yet made his boldest move. By the time Ted Bundy entered the courtroom as a defendant, he had already shown investigators something important. He did not think like other prisoners. Many accused criminals focused on fear, survival, or negotiation. Bundy often focused on opportunity. He studied rooms, he studied routines, he studied people. He noticed where guards stood, how doors opened, who paid attention, and who did not. Even while facing serious charges, his mind appeared fixed on one question: where is the weakness? That question would soon produce one of the most shocking moments in the entire case. Bundy had been jailed in Colorado while legal proceedings continued there. The charges were severe and the public interest was growing, but inside the jail, daily life still depended on human systems: locks, schedules, assumptions, habits. No matter how secure a building seemed, it was operated by people, and people could be distracted. Bundy requested access to a law library. This was not unusual. Defendants had rights. Legal preparation often required reading case law, notes, and records. Bundy was intelligent, articulate, and eager to involve himself in his defense. To some, his interest in legal material seemed consistent with his personality. To others, it looked strategic. Both views were true. He spent time reading. He handled paperwork. He projected seriousness, but behind that image, another plan was forming. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was taken to the courthouse library in Aspen, Colorado. He was not heavily restrained. He had earned a level of trust through behavior that seemed cooperative. Guards believed they understood the risk. They did not. At some point, Bundy moved toward an open window, then he jumped. In seconds, a legal session turned into a manhunt. He fell to the ground below, injured but mobile, and disappeared into the surrounding area. Authorities rushed outside. Officers searched roads, trails, and wooded terrain. News spread quickly. One of the country's most infamous defendants had escaped in broad daylight. For the public, it was astonishing. For investigators who had studied him, it was deeply revealing. Bundy was not simply defending himself in court. He was playing a larger game of control and survival. Every rule, every courtesy, every routine could become a tool. The mountains around Aspen became the setting for an intense search. Law enforcement teams tracked leads, questioned locals, and scanned wilderness paths. Bundy had escaped into rugged terrain with limited supplies. It was a desperate move, but desperation often mixed with confidence in him. He believed he could improvise. For several days he remained free, moving through forests and remote areas, reportedly stealing food and avoiding capture. But wilderness is unforgiving. Hunger, exposure, and exhaustion wear down even determined fugitives. Eventually he was caught. The first escape had failed, but it changed everything. Security tightened. Officers became more cautious. Courts saw more clearly that Bundy was not a normal defendant who would quietly wait for trial. He was resourceful, manipulative, and willing to take extraordinary risks. Yet even after being recaptured, he did not seem broken. Observers often noted a strange steadiness in him. He could speak calmly after chaos. He could present himself as reasonable after reckless acts. This ability to switch masks would become one of the most unsettling features of the trials to come. Then came the second escape. If the first one shocked authorities, the second would embarrass them. Bundy was later held in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. This time, security should have been stronger. Everyone knew what he had already done. Everyone knew he was dangerous. Everyone knew he could not be underestimated. And yet, inside his cell, he began preparing again. Reports later described how Bundy lost weight over time, making his body smaller. He also studied the ceiling area and the structure of the cell. He hid movements. He avoided drawing attention. He waited. Patience can be more dangerous than speed. In late December 1977, Bundy climbed through a hole he had created in the ceiling, entered the crawl space above, and eventually made his way out of the jailer's apartment while the jailer was away. Then he walked out, no dramatic chase, no smashed gates, no explosion, just silence, planning, and a door. It sounded almost unbelievable, but it was real. This time he vanished for weeks. Authorities across the country were alerted. Bundy had gone from local defendant to national fugitive. His name now carried a new layer of fear. If he could escape twice while facing murder charges, what might happen next? The answer would soon come in Florida. Bundy traveled across the country under assumed identities and with stolen resources. He moved through ordinary spaces while one of the largest manhunts in America searched for him. Gas stations, roads, rentals, city streets, he passed through them all as if he were just another traveler. That contrast haunted the public imagination. How could someone so widely wanted blend in so easily? Part of the answer was painfully simple. Many people still trusted appearances. He did not look like a movie villain. He looked like a student, a salesman, a young professional, a man with somewhere to be. People often search for danger in the wrong costume. As 1978 began, Bundy arrived in Florida. What followed there would become one of the darkest chapters in the case, and would finally bring him into the legal spotlight that made history. But even before those crimes were fully processed, another truth was becoming clear. The courtroom battles ahead would not involve a frightened defendant begging for mercy. They would involve a man who believed he could outtalk prosecutors, outmaneuver judges, charm viewers, and turn legal procedure into performance. That confidence fascinated the media. It also alarmed legal experts. Representing yourself in a major criminal case is risky under the best circumstances. Doing it while facing overwhelming public attention and severe charges was almost unimaginable. Yet Bundy seemed drawn to the role. He did not merely want to be judged. He wanted to participate. He wanted to question. He wanted to command attention. And perhaps most of all, he wanted to remain the central character in a story built from the suffering of others. As headlines followed his capture and transfer, families of victims waded through another painful cycle of delays and publicity. For them, this was not entertainment. It was not mystery. It was not a televised puzzle. It was grief stretched over years. That contrast matters. Because while cameras loved the spectacle of Bundy's escapes and courtroom confidence, the deeper story was about lives stolen, communities shaken, and justice repeatedly interrupted. Soon, Florida would become the place where that search for justice took its most public form. The nation would watch a defendant who smiled at cameras. They would watch a man cross-examine witnesses. They would watch bizarre moments that felt almost unreal, and they would watch a trial that changed how America understood crime, media, and manipulation. But first, Bundy had one more journey to make into a new state under a new spotlight, where the stakes were higher than ever, and the evidence waiting for him was stronger than before. Florida was warm, bright, and crowded with life. Tourists moved through streets, students returned to classes, cars rolled past palm trees and apartment buildings. To most people, it was an ordinary beginning to a new year. But in January 1978, danger had arrived quietly in the state, carrying no warning sign except a familiar face no one recognized. Ted Bundy was living under false names, moving through Florida after escaping custody in Colorado. He had crossed the country as a fugitive, slipping through gaps in systems meant to stop him. Now he was in a new place, unknown to many around him, but still driven by the same hidden violence that had followed him across states. Then, in the city of Tallahassee, events unfolded that would bring national attention crashing down. During the early hours of January 15, 1978, violence struck the Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University. The building, like many student residences, should have been a place of routine and safety. Young women slept inside, expecting another normal day ahead. Instead, the night became one of the most infamous chapters in American criminal history. The attack was swift and shocking. Survivors and witnesses later described confusion, fear, and the sudden sense that something impossible had happened in a familiar place. Within a short span of time, lives were changed forever. For investigators, the case immediately carried urgency. A brutal crime in a university setting created intense pressure. Students were frightened, families called loved ones. Rumors spread across campus and through the city. Police began collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing movements from the night. One witness had seen a man leaving the area. That detail mattered. In many major cases, the first hours are crucial. Memories are fresher. Physical evidence is less disturbed. Timelines can still be assembled before they fade into confusion. Detectives worked to preserve every possible clue, but at that moment, they did not yet know they were hunting one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. The public, meanwhile, reacted with a mixture of fear and disbelief. University communities often feel protected by routine, classes, dorms, friends, familiar buildings. Crimes like this shattered that illusion. Students began changing habits, doors were checked twice, walks at night felt different, parents worried from far away. Then only weeks later, another attack occurred in Florida, this time involving a young girl in Lake City. The pattern of violence deepened the urgency. Law enforcement now had reason to suspect a dangerous offender moving within the state. Pressure intensified. Every stop, every tip, every suspicious sighting suddenly carried greater meaning. And then came the traffic stop that ended the flight. On February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, a police officer noticed a suspicious vehicle. The driver attempted to evade contact. A struggle followed. The man was arrested. He identified himself falsely at first, but fingerprints told the truth. The fugitive from Colorado, the suspect tied to multiple investigations, the man whose name had spread across states, Ted Bundy, was finally in custody again. This time there would be no quiet proceedings. Florida intended to prosecute. Once the arrest became public, the case exploded into national news. Newspapers across the country carried his image. Television networks followed developments closely. The story had everything that attracts mass attention. A fugitive, multiple states, escapes, mystery, psychology, and now a major Florida prosecution connected to shocking crimes. Yet beneath the headlines stood a more serious reality. Evidence was being assembled. Witness accounts were reviewed. Forensic details were examined. Investigators built timelines, traced movements, and prepared for a courtroom battle unlike any many had seen before. Among the most discussed pieces of evidence would be bite-mark testimony connected to one of the victims. At the time, this kind of forensic evidence received enormous attention. Experts compared dental impressions and injuries, presenting conclusions that prosecutors believed strongly linked Bundy to the crime scene. Today, forensic science is discussed with more caution and evolving standards, but in that era, such evidence carried dramatic weight in court. There was also eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the broader context of Bundy's fugitive status and movements. The legal stakes were immense. Florida was not simply handling another criminal defendant. The state was preparing to try a man already known nationwide, a man associated with fear in several regions, a man who had escaped twice, and a man whose intelligence made him unusually unpredictable. Then Bundy made a decision that would transform the trial into something even stranger. He wanted significant control over his own defense. The idea stunned many observers. Defending yourself in a murder trial is dangerous enough. Doing so while under massive media pressure seemed almost unthinkable, but Bundy had long shown fascination with legal systems. He believed he understood process, argument, and presentation. Or perhaps he believed no one could perform Ted Bundy better than Ted Bundy himself. That distinction mattered. Some legal analysts later suggested his courtroom behavior was less about strategy and more about personality, control, ego, image, and the need to remain central. Others believed he genuinely thought he could create reasonable doubt through intelligence and charm. Whatever the motive, the result was unforgettable. The courtroom soon became more than a place for evidence. It became a stage where Bundy could speak, question, object, smile, and interact directly with the machinery judging him. For television audiences, it was mesmerizing. For prosecutors, it was a challenge requiring discipline. For victims' families, it could be painful to watch. The camera has a strange effect on justice. It can educate the public, it can create transparency, but it can also reward performance. In Bundy's case, that tension was visible every day. The nation watched not only the facts of the case, but the behavior of the man accused, how he stood, how he spoke, how he reacted, how he seemed at times to enjoy being watched. Yet the state's burden remained the same: prove guilt through evidence. No smile could erase testimony. No confidence could change timelines. No theatrics could remove physical clues. As pretrial motions continued and the courtroom prepared for opening arguments, anticipation grew. Reporters filled seats. Analysts debated tactics. Ordinary viewers who had never followed a murder trial before now paid attention. They were about to witness something rare in American legal history. One of the first nationally televised murder trials centered around a defendant who appeared determined to become his own lead performer. And once proceedings began, the moments inside that room would be stranger than many expected. There would be arguments over control. There would be direct confrontations. There would be flashes of charm and visible tension. There would be bizarre scenes that seemed almost impossible in a case of such seriousness. And somewhere inside all of it, 12 jurors would have to separate spectacle from truth. The cameras were ready. The judge would soon take the bench. And Ted Bundy, in a suit beneath the courtroom lights, was preparing to speak for himself. The room fell quiet when the judge entered. It was the kind of silence found only in courtrooms, where dozens of people suddenly stopped moving at once. Reporters lowered their voices. Pens hovered above notebooks. Spectators leaned forward. The sound of chairs settling against the floor seemed louder than usual. Then the trial began. For many watching across America, this was unlike anything they had seen before. Courtrooms had always held drama, but most people never witnessed that drama directly. Now cameras brought it into living rooms. Families watched after dinner. Office workers discussed it the next day. Students heard about it in class. The legal system, usually distant and formal, had become public theater, and at the center of that theater sat Ted Bundy. He wore suits, often appearing calm and composed. He did not look defeated. He did not look overwhelmed. Instead, he often seemed energized by the setting around him. The judge, the lawyers, the cameras, the audience, he appeared to understand that all eyes were on him. That attention mattered. Bundy had been granted the ability to participate heavily in his own defense, with attorneys available in supporting roles. It was a risky arrangement. Defendants have the right to represent themselves, but rights do not guarantee wisdom. Murder trials involve rules of evidence, procedure, strategy, witness management, jury psychology, and constant discipline. Even trained lawyers can struggle. Yet Bundy stepped into that role with visible confidence. He questioned witnesses, he objected, he argued points of procedure, he spoke directly to the court in a measured voice. To some viewers, he looked intelligent and self-assured. To others, he looked like a man trying to turn catastrophe into performance. The prosecution, meanwhile, had a very different task. They could not be distracted by personality. Their job was to present facts, evidence, and a coherent story of guilt. Every dramatic moment Bundy created had to be met with patience and precision. This was not a debate club, it was a murder trial. Still, Bundy's presence changed the atmosphere. When a defense attorney questions a witness, the exchange follows familiar patterns. But when the accused himself rises and begins questioning people connected to the case, the room feels different. There is tension, there is discomfort. There is the awareness that ordinary courtroom distance has collapsed. Witnesses now face the man prosecutors said was responsible. That reality could be emotionally difficult and deeply unsettling. Yet the proceedings continued. The state presented evidence connected to the Chi Omega case. Witnesses described events, movements, and observations from the night in question. Investigators explained how leads developed. Experts were called to interpret physical evidence. One of the most discussed areas involved bite mark testimony. At the time, prosecutors treated this evidence as powerful and compelling. Dental comparisons were presented to support identification. The courtroom listened closely. Jurors took notes. Reporters rushed details to the public. Modern audiences often view forensic claims through a more skeptical lens, but in that era, such testimony carried enormous dramatic force. It sounded scientific, specific, and persuasive. Bundy challenged what he could. He cross-examined. He attempted to expose uncertainty. He pressed witnesses on memory, detail, and interpretation. Sometimes he appeared polished, sometimes strained, sometimes sharp, sometimes scattered. That inconsistency told its own story. Representing yourself means performing many roles at once. You must listen like a client, think like a strategist, speak like an advocate, and remain emotionally controlled while your own future hangs in the balance. It is difficult under any conditions. Under national attention, it becomes far harder. There were moments when Bundy seemed to enjoy the exchange. He smiled at times. He leaned into argument. He used formal language and legal phrasing. He projected confidence even when the subject matter was devastating. Those moments fascinated viewers. They also disturbed many people who felt his demeanor showed detachment from the suffering at the center of the case. But courtroom impressions can be misleading. Confidence does not equal control. Style does not equal success. While cameras captured Bundy's manner, jurors were hearing the cumulative weight of evidence piece by piece, and that is how trials often work. Not through one dramatic reveal, not through a single shocking statement, but through accumulation, a witness here, a timeline there, a contradiction, a physical detail. A pattern that becomes harder to ignore. The judge played a critical role in maintaining order. Trials involving self-represented defendants can easily drift into chaos. Boundaries must be enforced. Rules must be applied evenly. Proceedings must move forward despite disruptions or unusual requests. There were tense exchanges. There were moments when Bundy pushed too far. There were reminders from the bench that procedure still mattered, no matter how famous the defendant had become. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy continued. Crowds gathered. News vans lined streets. People debated guilt and innocence with surprising confidence despite knowing only fragments of the evidence. This is one of the enduring lessons of high-profile trials. Many form conclusions early, long before the legal process ends. Public opinion can move faster than facts. Inside, jurors were expected to do the opposite. They had to listen carefully, ignore noise, weigh testimony, and focus only on what was properly before them. No easy task. As days passed, another reality emerged. Bundy's intelligence was real, but intelligence alone does not replace preparation, teamwork, or emotional distance. Professional defense lawyers divide tasks, refine strategy, and protect clients from their own impulses. A defendant representing himself may lose those safeguards. Some observers believed Bundy's need for control was weakening his case. Others believed he was still dangerous precisely because he remained unpredictable. Then came one of the strangest contrasts of the trial. While facing the most serious accusations imaginable, Bundy could shift into casual conversation, procedural debate, or polished argument as if participating in an ordinary professional matter. The emotional disconnect was hard for many to understand. How could someone behave so normally in such circumstances? That question would follow the entire case. Psychologists, journalists, and the public all searched for explanations. Narcissism, compartmentalization, manipulation, denial, performance, no single word fully captured it. But the trial was not over. The prosecution still had witnesses to call. The defense still had decisions to make, and Bundy still believed, at least outwardly, that he could influence the ending. Then, amid the formal language and strict procedure, the courtroom was about to witness a moment so unusual that it would be remembered for decades, not because of legal brilliance, but because it showed how bizarrely personal and theatrical this trial could become under the glare of national television. By now, the trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a national obsession. People who normally never followed court cases were now discussing witness testimony over breakfast. Evening news programs summarized each day's events. Newspapers placed updates on front pages. In living rooms across America, viewers watched a murder trial unfold almost like serialized television. And in the middle of it all, Ted Bundy seemed determined to remain unforgettable. The courtroom had already seen confidence, tension, and unusual moments. But what came next would push the trial into a category of strangeness rarely seen before, because Bundy did not only want to defend himself, he wanted to direct the emotional tone of the room. Trials are supposed to run on structure. Evidence is introduced, questions are asked, objections are ruled on. Emotions exist, of course, but the system tries to contain them inside procedure. Bundy repeatedly disrupted that balance. Sometimes it happened through long legal arguments over technical points, sometimes through sudden changes in strategy. Sometimes through his manner, smiling at odd moments, appearing casual when gravity should have dominated the room. And then came the moment many would never forget. During the Florida proceedings, Bundy used an old legal rule to declare marriage to Carol Ann Boone while in court. The scene felt almost unreal. Boone had known Bundy for years and supported him during parts of the case. She was present in court and had testified. Under certain legal conditions recognized at the time, a declaration made in court could carry legal significance. Bundy, always alert to attention and symbolism, seized the opportunity. He asked questions, he created the setup. Then, before the judge, lawyers, jurors, spectators, and national media, he turned the courtroom into something resembling a wedding stage. For many watching, it was shocking. For others, it was absurd. For victims' families, it could feel deeply painful. A room built for justice had suddenly become another platform for Bundy to center himself. The moment spread quickly through media coverage. It was exactly the kind of event television could not ignore. Bizarre, dramatic, unexpected, and deeply human in its confusion. Why would someone facing such severe charges choose to create a scene like this? The answer may lie in the same traits visible throughout the trial: control, attention, image management. The ability to force others to react. If the prosecution presented evidence, Bundy could still create headlines. If the courtroom focused on victims, he could redirect public conversation toward himself. If procedure boxed him in, he could turn procedure into theater. That was part of what made the trial so historically significant. It showed how modern media could amplify not only justice, but personality. Yet while headlines chased bizarre moments, the case itself continued moving forward. The prosecution kept building its narrative carefully. Witnesses described observations from the night of the crimes. Investigators explained the path from crime scene to suspect. Experts offered testimony that prosecutors believed tied Bundy directly to the attacks. Each witness added another thread. Individually, some details could be debated. Together, they formed a stronger picture. Bundy's cross-examinations remained one of the most unsettling features of the trial. There is something inherently uncomfortable about watching a person accused of violent crimes question those connected to the case against him. Even when done politely, the dynamic feels inverted. Some witnesses answered firmly, some appeared strained, some moments carried visible tension in the room. Bundy often tried to project intelligence and calm, but there were times when frustration surfaced. Legal pressure can expose cracks that confidence alone cannot hide. The longer the trial continued, the harder it became to sustain a flawless performance. And that is what many observers began noticing. He could be articulate, but not always persuasive. He could be composed, but not always consistent. He could command attention, but attention was not the same as victory. The judge continued managing a difficult courtroom environment. High-profile trials require discipline, even under normal conditions. Add cameras, intense public scrutiny, emotional stakes, and a self-represented defendant who seeks the spotlight, and every ruling becomes more delicate. there were reminders about procedure. There were sidebars, there were moments when the process itself seemed to strain under the weight of spectacle. Outside the courthouse, reactions divided. Some viewers remained strangely fascinated by Bundy's charm and intelligence. Others saw only manipulation. Many were trying to understand how someone capable of appearing so ordinary could stand accused of extraordinary cruelty. That question touched something larger in society. People often want danger to be easy to recognize. They want evil to announce itself clearly. Cases like Bundy's shattered that comfort. He did not fit the warning signs many imagined. He could speak smoothly, he could appear educated, he could smile for cameras, and that made the underlying reality harder, not easier to process. Meanwhile, for families affected by the crimes, the trial was never about psychology puzzles or media fascination. It was about accountability. Every delay, every bizarre scene, every headline centered on Bundy instead of victims could reopen pain. This tension remains one of the lasting lessons of the case. Who receives attention? Who gets remembered? Who becomes the story? As testimony neared critical stages, legal commentators began assessing the defense. Some believed Bundy's self-representation had damaged him. Others thought the evidence would have been difficult for any lawyer to overcome. But nearly everyone agreed on one point: the defendant had transformed the atmosphere of the trial. Not necessarily the outcome, the atmosphere, and there is a difference. A person may dominate conversation while quietly losing the case itself. Soon, that distinction would matter more than ever. Because closing arguments were approaching, the jurors had watched the performance. They had heard the evidence. They had seen the unusual marriage declaration, the courtroom confidence, the legal sparring, the moments of tension. Now they would have to retreat from noise and decide something far more serious than public fascination. Was the man in the suit before them simply a strange, theatrical defendant? Or was he exactly what prosecutors said he was? The answer would come sooner than Bundy may have hoped, and when it did, the trial would move into its most consequential phase yet. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt changed. Weeks of testimony had filled the air with facts, emotion, tension, and constant public attention. Jurors had listened to witnesses describe what they saw, what they remembered, what investigators found, and how the state believed all of it pointed to one man. They had also watched that man carefully. They had seen Ted Bundy speak with confidence. They had seen him challenge testimony. They had seen moments of charm, irritation, control, and theatrical behavior. Now, all of that had to be separated from the central question: what did the evidence prove? Closing arguments are often described as the final story each side tells. The witnesses are done, the exhibits are in, the facts have been introduced. Now lawyers gather those pieces and ask jurors to view them through a clear lens. For the prosecution, the message was direct. This was not coincidence. This was not mistaken identity. This was not a misunderstood fugitive caught in bad circumstances. They argued that the testimony, forensic evidence, timelines, and Bundy's own actions formed a coherent picture of guilt. His flight, his false identities, his history of evasion, and the evidence from the crime scene were not random fragments. They were connected parts of one truth. The defense, much of it shaped by Bundy himself, attempted to create doubt. Doubt about memory, doubt about identification, doubt about interpretation, doubt about the certainty claimed by experts. That is often the defense path when evidence appears strong. If certainty can be weakened, reasonable doubt may survive, but there is a difference between raising questions and persuading jurors. And no one in the courtroom yet knew where that line would fall. Then the case was placed in the hands of 12 people. The jury retired to deliberate. It is one of the quietest and most powerful moments in any trial. After weeks of noise, cameras, argument, and headlines, everything narrows to a closed room and ordinary citizens discussing what they believe happened. No microphones, no speeches for television. No dramatic music, just judgment. Outside, the waiting began. Reporters filled hallways. Families sat with private thoughts. Lawyers reviewed possibilities. Bundy waited. How does a person like Bundy experience such waiting? No one can fully know, but observers often noted that he tried to maintain calm. Whether that calm was genuine confidence, practiced detachment, or denial was impossible to measure. Then the jury returned. The room stood. The verdict was read, guilty. The words were simple. Their impact was not, for prosecutors, it was validation of a long and difficult case. For victims' loved ones, it was a moment tied to grief rather than celebration. For the public, it was the dramatic turning point many had anticipated. For Bundy, it was the collapse of the most immediate battle, yet the proceedings were not over. In capital cases, another stage follows, sentencing, and this phase would produce one of the most famous moments in American courtroom history. The judge presiding over the trial, Edward Cowart, had managed one of the most unusual and highly publicized cases of the era. He had watched Bundy's legal maneuvers, courtroom theatrics, and attempts at control. He had also presided over evidence tied to devastating crimes. When sentencing came, the atmosphere shifted again. Trials can contain spectacle. Sentencing often strips it away. This was no longer about tactics or cross-examination. It was about consequence. Judge Cowart addressed Bundy directly in words that would be quoted for decades. He acknowledged Bundy's intelligence and abilities, expressing that Bundy could have chosen a different life. It was a striking moment because it recognized a truth many found unsettling. Bundy was not foolish or incapable. He possessed gifts he had turned toward destruction. Then the sentence was imposed. Death, the courtroom absorbed the weight of it. Some people felt relief. Others felt sorrow at the scale of everything lost. Some focused on justice. Others on the grim finality of the punishment itself. In major criminal cases, reactions are rarely simple. Bundy, even then, remained outwardly composed. That composure fascinated many observers. How could someone hear such a sentence and appear controlled? Again, interpretations varied. Some saw emotional emptiness. Some saw performance. Some saw a man refusing to surrender dignity in public. But whatever his internal state, the legal reality had changed permanently. Still, the story was not finished. Bundy faced additional legal exposure. Florida had more than one case connected to him. Other states had unresolved matters. Appeals were expected. The conviction was historic, but not the final chapter. Meanwhile, the public response revealed something important about media culture. Millions had watched a courtroom not only for justice, but for drama. They analyzed gestures. They debated personality. They replayed strange moments. They treated legal proceedings almost like episodic entertainment. This created discomfort for many legal scholars and journalists. Trials served serious purposes. They determine liberty, accountability, and truth under law, but television can reward charisma and conflict in ways that distort priorities. Bundy seemed to understand that instinctively. Even in defeat, he remained a figure people discussed endlessly. Why? Partly because he challenged assumptions. People wanted villains to look monstrous. He looked ordinary. People wanted intelligence to align with morality. It did not. People wanted courtroom guilt to feel obvious from the start. Instead, they watched a polished defendant speak confidently for weeks before conviction arrived. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about appearance, manipulation, and attention. And yet, behind every social lesson remained individual loss. Young women whose futures were never lived, families whose lives divided into before and after, communities that learned fear in places once considered safe. Those realities can be overshadowed by famous defendants. They should not be. As reporters rushed to file verdict stories, many believed they had witnessed the defining Bundy trial. They were wrong. Another Florida case still waited. Another courtroom still had to hear evidence. Another jury would soon be selected. And Bundy, though convicted and sentenced, was not done trying to influence what came next. The cameras would return. The nation would watch again. And in the next trial, the image of control he fought to maintain would face new pressure from evidence that was harder to escape and a future growing narrower by the day. Most famous trials end when the verdict is read. This one did not. Ted Bundy had been convicted in the Chi Omega case and sentenced to death, yet another major prosecution still stood ahead in Florida. The public had already watched one extraordinary courtroom drama, but the legal system was not finished with him. Another victim, another case, another jury, and another test of the man who seemed unable to stop performing even as the walls closed in. The next trial centered on the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City, Florida. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The earlier proceedings had already been heavy with national attention, but this case carried a different emotional gravity. The victim was a child. That fact alone changed the tone of everything. Courtrooms can become accustomed to legal language, motions, objections, procedure, evidence. but sometimes a single fact cuts through all formalism and reminds everyone why they are there. A child had not come home. The prosecution prepared to present a case built from movement, witness observations, physical evidence, and the path investigators traced after Bundy's capture. They intended to show that this was not an unrelated tragedy, but another crime connected to the same man already convicted in Florida. Bundy again sought to involve himself in the defense. By now, the public recognized the pattern. He did not fade quietly into the background. He challenged procedure. He inserted himself into legal decisions. He tried to retain the posture of a participant rather than a condemned man awaiting outcomes, but repetition changes perception. During the first televised trial, some viewers had been captivated by the novelty of a defendant acting as his own advocate. Now, many saw less novelty and more desperation. The same confidence that once seemed unusual could now appear hollow. Still, the courtroom remained tense. Juries are not supposed to decide cases based on previous convictions. Each trial must stand on its own evidence. That principle is fundamental to justice. Even a deeply unpopular defendant is entitled to a fair proceeding. The burden remains on the state. So once again, witnesses took the stand. Investigators described timelines. Experts explained findings. Individuals who had seen relevant movements or circumstances recounted what they remembered. The prosecution's story was cumulative, piece after piece, movement after movement, fact after fact. Bundy responded through questions and legal maneuvering. At times he appeared focused. At times distracted, at times determined to project the same self-command seen before, but the pressure was different now. He was no longer simply a man accused. He was already a convicted murderer under sentence of death. That reality changed the emotional landscape, even if the legal standards remained the same. Observers noticed that his courtroom presence could still draw attention, but it no longer dominated the room in the same way. The shock had worn off, the novelty had faded. What remained was a defendant facing narrowing options. This is one of the strange laws of public spectacle. It burns hot, then cools. What once seemed electrifying can become familiar. What once felt like control can begin to look like routine stalling. And yet Bundy continued. He spoke carefully. He consulted notes. He questioned details. He looked for openings. Whether he truly believed he could reverse his trajectory or simply could not stop trying to command the stage remains debated. The judge again had to balance fairness with order. High-profile defendants sometimes test boundaries constantly. Every request must be considered. Every ruling can become controversial. Every visible reaction may be interpreted by the public. Courtroom management is not glamorous, but it is essential. Outside, media coverage continued, though the tone had shifted. Early fascination with Bundy's intelligence and strange charisma increasingly shared space with a darker recognition. This was not a puzzle about personality. It was a chain of human tragedies. For families of victims, that recognition had never disappeared. While commentators discussed strategy, they lived with absence. While headlines focused on Bundy's remarks, they remembered birthdays that would never be celebrated, plans that would never unfold, conversations that would never happen again. Trials often reveal two parallel stories. One is public and loud, the other is private and permanent. As testimony continued in the Kimberly Leach case, the prosecution emphasized the practical language of proof. Not myth, not media legend, not psychological fascination. Proof where people were seen. What was found, how timelines aligned, why the evidence pointed in one direction. Bundy's defense sought to challenge certainty where possible. But the deeper problem for him was larger than any single objection. The narrative of control he had cultivated was collapsing under accumulated reality. Escapes, captures, convictions, evidence, sentences, each event narrowed the space available for reinvention. Even so, he remained outwardly composed more often than not. That composure continued to puzzle observers. Some people expected visible breakdown, others thought he would become openly hostile. Instead, he often maintained a measured exterior. But a calm face can hide many things: stress, fear, denial, calculation, resignation. No camera can reliably distinguish them. Then came the waiting once more. The jury received the case. Another closed room, another group of citizens asked to weigh life-altering decisions. Outside, the nation watched for a result many assumed was coming, but assumptions are not verdicts. The legal system still required the final step. When the jury returned, the room again rose. The verdict was read, guilty, another conviction, another devastating legal defeat for Bundy. Another confirmation in the eyes of the court that the violence linked to him had not ended with one case. Sentencing followed, and once again the sentence was death. 2 Florida death sentences now stood against him. The man who once jumped from windows, slipped through ceilings, and challenged witnesses under television lights was now confined by judgments far more powerful than locks. Yet the story still did not end, because capital cases moved slowly. Appeals would come, interviews would happen, years would pass. And in those years, Bundy would continue trying to shape how the world saw him, sometimes denying, sometimes hinting, sometimes manipulating. Sometimes speaking in ways that seemed designed to keep attention fixed on himself. The courtroom chapters had delivered verdicts, but the psychological battle over truth, image, and legacy was only beginning. And in the long years after the trials, the public would confront an even stranger question. What happens when a man who can no longer escape physically begins trying to escape through narrative instead? After the verdicts, the cameras did not disappear. In many cases, public attention fades once a sentence is handed down. Reporters move on, headlines shrink, another story replaces the last one. But Ted Bundy was no ordinary defendant, and the trials had turned him into something rare and troubling in American culture. A criminal figure whose notoriety continued growing even after conviction. Now the stage changed, no longer a courtroom but prison, no longer jurors but interviewers, no longer legal arguments but a struggle over narrative. Bundy had lost in court. He could no longer cross-examine witnesses or object before a judge, but he still possessed one tool he had relied on for years, his ability to speak persuasively, or at least memorably. And he intended to use it. Death row is built on waiting, days become routines, time stretches strangely, appeals move slowly through higher courts, legal documents replace dramatic testimony. Public moments come in flashes, a hearing, an interview, a new filing, a rumor of execution dates. For some inmates, the years become silent. For Bundy, silence was rarely the choice. Journalists, psychologists, law enforcement figures, and curious members of the public wanted to understand him. How had he lived such a double life? Why had he committed the crimes? Was he insane, evil, addicted to violence, or something else entirely? Could someone like him explain himself truthfully? These questions attracted endless attention. Bundy understood that attention had value. As long as people wanted answers, he remained relevant. This is one reason post-conviction interviews became so important. They were not simply conversations. They were contests between questioners seeking truth and a convicted killer who still knew how to shape impressions. Sometimes he denied, sometimes he minimized. Sometimes he redirected blame. Sometimes he spoke abstractly, as if discussing another person rather than himself. This shifting style frustrated many investigators. Straight answers were rare. Admissions, when they came, were often partial, delayed, or tangled in self-serving explanations. Yet people kept listening. Part of the fascination came from contradiction. He was educated but destructive, calm but violent, polite in speech yet tied to horrific acts. People often search for a single explanation that makes contradictions disappear. Cases like Bundy's resist that comfort. There was also another layer: appeals. Capital cases in America involve multiple levels of review. Convictions and sentences are challenged through legal arguments about evidence, procedure, constitutional rights, jury issues, and representation. This can take years. Supporters of the system call it necessary caution in matters of life and death. Critics call it painful delay. For families of victims, those years can feel like being trapped in unfinished time. Every new filing reopens memory. Every hearing revives headlines. Every postponed date extends uncertainty. While the public consumed documentaries, articles, and courtroom clips, many families were still living the consequences privately. Bundy, meanwhile, continued trying to manage perception. He gave interviews in which he could sound analytical and controlled. He sometimes discussed criminal behavior in detached terms, presenting himself almost like an observer. That style could be compelling to audiences unfamiliar with manipulation tactics. It sounded intelligent, reflective even, but intelligence and honesty are not the same thing. A person skilled with words can use them to reveal or conceal. Bundy often seemed to do both. Some experts who studied such offenders warned against treating self-descriptions as objective truth. Individuals with narcissistic or manipulative traits may reshape events to protect ego, gain sympathy, or maintain power over listeners. In Bundy's case, every statement required caution. Still, the interviews mattered historically because they revealed something about the post-trial era. The courtroom had punished his actions, but society was still vulnerable to his image. This remains one of the central lessons of the Bundy story. Justice can convict a person, yet culture may continue rewarding their mystique. The line between understanding crime and glamorizing criminals can become dangerously thin. During these years, Bundy's supporters also drew attention. Some people wrote letters. Some believed he had been misunderstood. Some were drawn to notoriety itself. High-profile criminal cases often attract those who project fantasies, seek contact with fame, or become fascinated by darkness from a safe distance. To many observers, this was deeply unsettling. How could a convicted serial killer still inspire loyalty? Again, the answer returns to appearance, charisma, and the psychology of distance. It is easier to romanticize a symbol than confront the human reality of the crimes. Meanwhile, the legal clock kept ticking. Execution dates were set and delayed. Appeals were filed and denied. Years passed, America changed around the case. New headlines came and went. Yet Bundy's name remained in public memory, partly because his trials had been so visible and partly because he continued feeding attention through interviews and shifting stories. There was one subject he repeatedly circled in different ways: pornography. Late in life, Bundy gave interviews in which he suggested violent pornography had influenced him. These claims generated major media interest. Some saw them as confession mixed with warning. Others believed they were another attempt to redirect responsibility onto external forces. The debate continues. Can harmful media shape behavior? Sometimes influences matter in complex ways, but influence is not the same as excuse. Millions consume material without committing crimes. Ultimately, responsibility for Bundy's actions remained with Bundy. Yet even in discussing causes, he found ways to place himself within larger cultural debates. That pattern was familiar. If the world asked, why did this happen, he often answered in ways that kept himself central. As the 1980s moved forward, appeals narrowed. The possibility that execution would truly occur became more real. For the first time, Bundy's skill with delay and narrative faced a deadline that words alone might not move. Observers wondered what he would do then. Would he confess fully? Would he continue denying? Would fear finally break the composed exterior seen in court? Would he try one last reinvention? Soon, the waiting years would end. The man who once stood in televised courtrooms speaking for himself would confront a setting with no audience to persuade, no jury to influence, and no escape route left. And in those final days, he would begin talking in ways he never had before. As the 1980s neared their end, time became harder for Ted Bundy to control. For years, delays had been part of the landscape. Appeals were filed, dates changed, lawyers argued procedure, courts reviewed records. The machinery of capital punishment moved slowly, as it often does. That slowness had given Bundy space to speak, to deny, to hint, to remain in public view. But now the space was shrinking. Execution dates were no longer distant possibilities discussed in legal language. They were becoming real calendar events. The future that once felt negotiable was narrowing into something exact. And when deadlines become real, behavior often changes. Bundy had long resisted full accountability. He had admitted little for years and often positioned himself as misunderstood, overcharged, or unfairly portrayed. But as the final stage approached, investigators noticed a shift. He was becoming more willing to talk, not suddenly honest in a simple sense, not transformed into a transparent narrator, but more willing than before. Law enforcement officials and investigators recognized the significance immediately. Across multiple states, families still lacked answers. Some cases remained unresolved or only partially understood. If Bundy possessed information about victims, locations, timelines, or methods, those details could matter deeply. So interviews intensified, detectives met with him, questions were revisited. Names were raised, memories were tested. For Bundy, speaking now served more than one purpose. It may have been bargaining. It may have been an attempt to delay execution by offering information. It may have been a need to remain important until the very end. it may have contained moments of truth mixed with self-interest. Human motives are rarely singular, especially in high-stakes moments. During these final interviews, Bundy often described crimes in a detached style. Sometimes he used third-person language, as if placing distance between himself and his actions. Sometimes he spoke with detail that suggested memory remained sharp. Sometimes he appeared to reveal facts only gradually, almost measuring the value of each answer. This was painful for many families and investigators alike. Answers that had been withheld for years were now emerging under the pressure of an execution date. Closure, if it came at all, arrived tangled with frustration. One of the most haunting aspects of long-delayed confessions is timing. Why now? Why not when families first begged for truth? Why only when personal consequences can no longer be postponed? These questions linger around many historic cases, and Bundy's was no exception. The media once again surged forward. Television crews gathered, journalists reported each new statement, experts debated sincerity. The same culture that had once watched him in court now watched him in confinement, searching his final words for insight. But insight can be deceptive. A person may explain themselves in ways that sound meaningful while still protecting their ego. Bundy's late claims about causes, influences, and inner struggles were widely discussed, yet many remained skeptical. He had spent years managing impressions. Why assume that instinct disappeared at the end? Still, some practical truths did emerge. Investigators gained information. Certain cases became clearer. Families in some instances received details they had long sought, even if those details brought sorrow rather than peace. The emotional complexity is difficult to overstate. Answers can matter deeply. Yet no answer restores what was lost. As the final execution date approached in January 1989, public attention reached another peak. Outside the prison in Florida, crowds gathered. Some came in support of capital punishment. Some came from curiosity. Some came because the case had become a symbol larger than one man. The atmosphere was unsettling in its own way. Justice systems are solemn institutions, yet famous cases can attract carnival-like energy around their final moments. Vendors reportedly appeared. Cameras broadcast updates. The line between public event and public spectacle again became blurred. Inside prison walls, the reality was quieter and far more serious. Legal teams made final efforts. Officials prepared procedures. Bundy met with attorneys, clergy, and interviewers. The man who once commanded courtroom attention was now in a place where schedules were set by others. Observers continued wondering whether fear would finally show itself. Accounts from final days vary in tone, but many noted increased urgency and attempts to continue negotiating through information. Whether this reflected genuine remorse, fear of death, instinctive manipulation, or some mixture of all three is still debated. Then there was the question of legacy. By now, Bundy's name had become shorthand for a certain kind of criminal contradiction, outward normalcy hiding extreme violence. Criminologists studied the case. Media retold it. The public returned to it repeatedly, but legacy is not the same as meaning. The danger in infamous cases is that the offender becomes larger than the victims in cultural memory. Bundy had sought attention throughout the trials and after them. Society often gave it to him. The challenge for later generations would be remembering the full story, not just the most sensational character within it. On the eve of execution, tension stretched across the country. Some people felt justice was finally arriving after years of delay. Others opposed the death penalty in principle. Many simply watched history nearing its endpoint. Yet even now, the story held uncertainty. Would he confess more? Would he issue apology? Would he maintain control to the end? Would the final hours reveal something hidden beneath years of performance? Morning was coming. The prison lights stayed on. Outside, cameras waited in the dark. And inside, Ted Bundy was entering the last night of a life that had reshaped courts, media, criminal investigation, and the national imagination in ways few cases ever had. The final morning began before sunrise. Inside Florida State Prison, routines moved with deliberate precision. Officers followed procedures practiced many times before. Legal paperwork had been completed. Final appeals had run their course. The waiting that had stretched across years was over. Outside the prison gates, crowds gathered in darkness. Television crews stood beneath artificial lights. Reporters spoke quietly into microphones. Some people held signs. Some came to witness what they saw as justice. others came out of curiosity. Others opposed the death penalty but recognized the historic weight of the moment. The atmosphere was tense, strange, and divided. A man whose crimes had caused fear across the country was about to die by order of the state. Few cases carry such symbolic force. Bundy had become more than a prisoner in public imagination. He represented debates about evil, deception, media spectacle, punishment, psychology, and the limits of appearance. Now all of those debates were converging at one place, one morning, 1 hour. Inside, final visits and final conversations took place. Accounts from those final hours describe a man under visible pressure. That should surprise no one. Whatever image Bundy had projected in courtrooms or interviews, the reality before him was immediate and irreversible. The legal games were over. There would be no next hearing, no next motion, no next delay. Only the clock. Many people later asked whether he showed remorse. The answer depends on what one means by remorse. There were statements, there were expressions of concern for families. There were conversations in which he offered information. Yet genuine remorse is difficult to measure, especially in the final hours of someone who had spent years managing perception. Words spoken at the end may be sincere, strategic, incomplete, or all three at once. The human heart is not easily read from transcripts. As the execution hour approached, witnesses assembled inside the designated chamber. Official witnesses, journalists, and selected observers took their places. Such settings are intentionally controlled. The state does not conduct executions as open spectacles, even when the public interest is enormous, and yet history was present in that room. This was the end of one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern America. Bundy was brought in. Gone was the courtroom stage, the defense table, the suit beneath bright cameras. Gone were the arguments, objections, smiles, and performances that had once captivated viewers. In their place was the stark simplicity of consequence. He was secured in the electric chair. For many people today, the method itself feels like a relic from another era. But in 1989, it remained part of Florida's legal system. Its symbolism was severe, almost grimly theatrical in its own right, a reminder that states, too, use ritual and procedure when exercising ultimate power. Witnesses observed quietly. Some looked directly, some could not. The final statement attributed to Bundy was brief. He spoke words of love to family and friends, then the sentence was carried out. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. Outside, the news moved instantly. Reporters rushed updates onto live broadcasts. Crowds reacted. Some cheered, some celebrated openly. Others stood in silence. Some felt relief. Some felt discomfort at the joy of execution. Public responses to notorious cases often reveal as much about society as about the criminal himself. For families of victims, the moment was personal in ways cameras could never capture. No execution can restore lost years. No sentence can return a daughter, sister, friend, or child. At best, the legal process can acknowledge wrongdoing, impose accountability, and bring an end to uncertainty. Whether that end feels like peace is different for every person touched by the crimes. Across the country, newspapers and television framed the event as the closing chapter of a dark era. Yet endings in famous cases are rarely complete. Bundy was dead, but the questions surrounding him remained alive. How had he hidden in plain sight? Why did so many trust appearances? What warning signs had been missed? Could similar offenders be identified earlier in the future? What role had media played in turning trials into spectacle? These questions would outlast him. The courtroom legacy alone was immense. Bundy's trials helped define the modern relationship between crime and television. They showed that legal proceedings could become national entertainment, for better and worse. Public access created transparency. It also created celebrity around a defendant who repeatedly sought attention. The psychological legacy was equally significant. Bundy forced society to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. Danger does not always announce itself through obvious signals. Intelligence, politeness, education, and outward normalcy can coexist with hidden violence. That lesson has echoed through criminal profiling, public awareness campaigns, and countless later discussions of trust and manipulation. The investigative legacy mattered too. His crimes pushed agencies across jurisdictions to cooperate more effectively. Cases spread across states exposed weaknesses in fragmented systems. Over time, law enforcement methods evolved in part because older systems had been tested so painfully. and still, one issue remained unresolved in public memory. Why are people so fascinated by figures like Bundy? Part of the answer lies in fear. We study what threatens us. Part lies in contradiction. We are drawn to mysteries that break our assumptions. Part lies in media culture, which often rewards dramatic personalities over quieter truths. But fascination carries risk. It can center the offender while erasing those harmed. That is why the most responsible retellings return to the victims, the investigations, the legal process, and the lessons learned, not merely the charisma of the accused. As morning light spread beyond the prison walls, the man who once represented himself under national cameras was gone. Yet his story was not finished in another sense. Because after death came transformation into legend, warning, myth, case study, and repeated retelling. Books would be written, films would be made, debates would continue. And the battle over what Ted Bundy's story should mean had only just begun. Death ended Ted Bundy's life. It did not end the story. In many ways, it began a new chapter. Once a notorious criminal dies, the legal drama stops. There are no more appeals, no more hearings, no more interviews from prison cells, but something else often takes its place: memory. And memory is not passive. It is shaped by books, documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, academic studies, rumors, dramatic retellings, and the changing values of each new generation. Bundy entered that world immediately. Within hours of his execution, newspapers across America published front-page reflections on the case. Some focused on the crimes, some focused on the punishment. Some focused on the strange journey from promising law student to convicted serial killer. Television networks replayed old courtroom footage, showing the man who once smiled, argued, and represented himself beneath bright lights. For younger viewers who had missed the trials, these images were shocking. He did not look like the stereotype of a monster. That contrast continued to drive fascination. But there is a danger when history becomes image. A few seconds of courtroom footage can create the illusion that a person is fully understood. A confident glance, a calm voice, a neat haircut, these details become symbols. Yet symbols can flatten reality. Bundy was not a mystery character in a script. He was a real defendant tied to real victims, real families, and real decades of grief. Still, the retellings multiplied. Authors wrote biographies. Criminologists analyzed patterns. Psychologists debated personality disorders, narcissism, psychopathy, and compulsion. Journalists revisited investigative failures and courtroom strategy. Filmmakers explored the story through drama and documentary. Each version answered a different question. What happened? How did it happen? Why did people watch? What can society learn? No single answer satisfied everyone. Some accounts centered on Bundy's manipulation and deceptive charm. Others focused on policing methods of the 1970s and how fragmented systems allowed him to move across jurisdictions. Some highlighted the rise of televised justice. Others examined the ethics of turning tragedy into entertainment. That final issue became especially important. When a criminal case becomes famous, public attention often concentrates on the offender. Their name becomes recognizable, their face becomes iconic, their quotes are repeated. Meanwhile, victims may be remembered less clearly or only in lists. This imbalance is one of the deepest moral questions in true crime storytelling. Who gets remembered most? Who receives complexity? Who becomes the center of the narrative? Bundy's case forced many creators and audiences to confront those questions directly, because he was undeniably compelling as a subject, not admirable. Not sympathetic, compelling, and those are not the same thing. People are often drawn to contradictions. Bundy looked ordinary but was accused of extraordinary violence. He seemed intelligent yet made reckless choices. He could appear controlled while living a life of chaos. Contradictions create narrative gravity. But gravity can pull attention in unhealthy directions. Some later portrayals were criticized for making him seem too glamorous or too fascinating. Others were praised for restoring focus to victims and investigators. The debate itself revealed how uneasy society remained about the story. There was also a practical legacy. Bundy's crimes and trials became case studies in law enforcement training. Investigators looked back at missed opportunities, communication gaps, and behavioral patterns. The era before modern databases had exposed serious weaknesses. Over time, interagency cooperation improved, and missing persons investigations became more sophisticated. In this sense, painful history contributed to institutional change. The legal world studied the trials as well. His self-representation remains one of the most discussed examples of a defendant using courtroom rights in highly unusual ways. Law students and legal analysts examine the tension between autonomy and strategy. A person may have the right to represent themselves, but when does that right become self-destruction? How should judges manage defendants who seek attention as much as acquittal? These questions did not end with Bundy. They echo in later high-profile cases whenever courtroom performance threatens to overshadow evidence. The public, meanwhile, continued asking a simpler question: could it happen again? The honest answer is yes, though not in the same form. Every era has its own blind spots. In the 1970s, many people trusted appearance too easily, and systems shared information too slowly. Today, technology has changed investigations dramatically, yet deception still exists, manipulation still exists, dangerous people can still present themselves as ordinary. The lesson is not paranoia. It is awareness. Trust should be thoughtful, not automatic. Charm should never substitute for character. Image should never outrank evidence. Bundy's name also entered everyday language in uncomfortable ways. Sometimes people referenced him casually as shorthand for hidden evil or dangerous charisma. This reflects how deeply the case entered culture, but it can also trivialize real suffering when used carelessly. History can become cliché if repeated without care, and this story deserves care. Because behind every headline were individuals whose futures were stolen. Students with plans, children with families, communities marked by fear, parents who waited for calls that never came. Siblings who carried unanswered questions for years. Those realities are quieter than courtroom theatrics. They are also more important. As the 1990s approached, America moved into a new media age. Cable television expanded, talk shows multiplied. Later, the internet would transform crime storytelling entirely. Bundy's case became one of the bridges between old and new worlds, a newspaper-era story that evolved into a television obsession and later a digital-era phenomenon. His trials had once been cutting-edge media events. Now they were archival footage studied by new generations, yet one mystery still lingered in public conversation. Not whether he committed the crimes in the eyes of the courts, not whether the sentence had been carried out, but whether society had truly learned the right lessons from the spectacle. Because it is possible to remember a famous criminal and still miss the meaning of the case entirely. And as new decades arrived, that question would return again and again whenever cameras entered courtrooms, whenever charisma met accusation, and whenever audiences struggled to look past performance and see the truth beneath it. Years passed, but the footage never seemed to age. The grainy courtroom video still showed Ted Bundy leaning over a table, speaking with confidence, smiling at strange moments, acting less like a defendant and more like a man trying to host the room. New generations discovered those clips long after the trials had ended. For many, it felt surreal. How could someone facing such accusations appear so composed? How could a murder trial look at times like a performance? And why were millions still watching decades later? These questions reveal something important. The Bundy story is not remembered only because of the crimes. It is remembered because it exposed uncomfortable truths about how society responds to crime. We do not only seek justice. We also seek stories. That instinct is ancient. Humans gather around mysteries, conflict, danger, and moral drama. Courtrooms naturally contain all of these elements. There are opposing sides, uncertain outcomes, hidden facts, emotional stakes, and the possibility of truth emerging under pressure. Television simply amplified what was already there. Bundy's trials arrived at a moment when media technology was expanding and public appetite for real-life drama was growing. Cameras transformed the local courtroom into a national stage. The public could witness gestures, hear tone of voice, and feel the suspense of unfolding testimony. That access had value. It made the justice system more visible. It allowed citizens to observe institutions that usually operate at a distance. It turned abstract legal rights into something people could actually see, but access also came with costs. Cameras reward visual moments. They favor personality. They compress complex evidence into short clips. They can make viewers feel like experts after watching fragments. Bundy seemed unusually suited to that environment. He understood attention instinctively. He knew that a sentence spoken confidently could echo louder than a page of forensic detail. He knew that strange behavior could become headline material. He knew that if people were talking about him, he still occupied the center of the story. This is why many scholars view the trials as an early warning about media-era justice. The danger was never only Ted Bundy. The danger was what happens when spectacle competes with substance. We still live with that problem today. Modern high-profile cases unfold across television, websites, live streams, podcasts, short clips, and social media posts. Public opinion can form before evidence is fully presented. Rumors travel faster than corrections. Personality can overshadow fact. Outrage can become entertainment. In that sense, the Bundy era never truly ended. It simply changed platforms. There was another lesson hidden inside the fascination. Many viewers focused on Bundy because they wanted to understand evil. That impulse is natural. People hope that by studying extreme offenders, they can recognize warning signs and prevent future harm. But the search for understanding can drift into myth-making. The criminal becomes larger than life. Ordinary details are ignored. Contradictions are exaggerated into mystery. The person becomes a dark celebrity rather than a human being who made choices. Bundy's case often sits on that edge. Some portrayals present him almost as an unstoppable mastermind. Yet the historical record also shows failures, luck, recklessness, ego, and repeated dependence on others underestimating him. He was dangerous but not magical. He was manipulative but not all-powerful. That distinction matters. Myths make offenders seem rare and extraordinary. Reality reminds us they are human beings whose actions can be studied, interrupted, and prevented. The victims deserve that reality. They should not be remembered as side characters in the story of a famous killer. They were individuals with their own ambitions, friendships, talents, and futures. Responsible storytelling restores that perspective whenever public memory drifts too far toward the offender. Investigators deserve remembrance too. The detectives of the 1970s worked without tools later generations take for granted. No smartphones, no rapid digital databases, no instant data sharing between agencies. They relied on interviews, paper records, persistence, and collaboration that often had to be built from scratch. Their work helped expose patterns across state lines and laid groundwork for future improvements. The judges and lawyers deserve study as well. Bundy's self-representation became a landmark example of how legal rights can collide with courtroom order. A defendant may insist on autonomy even when it harms their own case. Judges must protect fairness without surrendering control of proceedings. It is a delicate balance, and the Bundy trials remain a dramatic illustration of that challenge. Then there is the personal lesson. Many people assume danger will feel obvious. They expect alarms in their instincts. They imagine threats arriving in frightening forms. But manipulation often wears ordinary clothing. It may sound polite, it may seem educated, it may ask for help in a calm voice. That does not mean everyone should distrust everyone else. It means confidence should be paired with awareness, and kindness should never replace caution. As documentaries and dramatizations continued through later decades, public reactions evolved. Some audiences became more critical of glamorized portrayals. Others demanded stronger focus on victims and social context. Many true crime creators began asking harder ethical questions. Are we informing or exploiting? Are we honoring victims or selling fear? Are we teaching caution or feeding obsession? Those questions matter because stories shape culture. What we emphasize becomes what people remember, and the Bundy story, perhaps more than most, forces a final uncomfortable realization. The same qualities that made him dangerous, deception, performance, manipulation, can also shape the way history remembers him if audiences are not careful. The courtroom lights turned off long ago. The verdicts were entered decades ago. The sentence was carried out. Yet the trial continues in another form every time someone watches the footage and decides what, exactly, they believe this story is about. And that decision leads us into an even deeper question. When society stares at darkness for too long, what does it begin to reveal about itself? When society stares at darkness for too long, it often expects to learn only about the darkness. But famous criminal cases reveal something else. They reveal us. They show what captures our attention, what we fear, what we misunderstand, what we forgive too quickly, and what we struggle to face. The story of Ted Bundy was never only about one man in a courtroom. It became a mirror held up to an entire culture, and what that mirror reflected was complicated. America in the late 1970s and 1980s was changing rapidly. Trust in institutions had been shaken by political scandals. Television had become the dominant storyteller in millions of homes. Crime reporting was becoming more national, more visual, more immediate. The public wanted access, explanation, and certainty in an uncertain age. Then came a defendant who seemed built for the camera. He was articulate, he was composed, he looked ordinary, he could speak in complete, polished sentences while accused of horrifying acts. He could smile where others expected shame. He could create bizarre moments in rooms built for seriousness. He could turn legal procedure into spectacle, and so millions watched. Some watched from fear, some watched from curiosity, some watched because everyone else was watching. Some watched because they believed understanding him might protect them from future danger. Some watched because human beings are naturally drawn to mystery, but there was always a cost. Every minute spent admiring the strange charisma of the defendant was a minute not spent remembering the lives interrupted by him. Every headline about courtroom theatrics risked pushing grieving families into the background. Every retelling that centered his intelligence risked confusing intelligence with depth or importance. This is how dangerous people can continue influencing the world even after conviction. Not through freedom, through attention. That lesson matters more now than ever. Today, information moves faster than at any point in human history. A courtroom clip can circle the globe in minutes. A dramatic image can outweigh pages of evidence. A rumor can outrun the truth before breakfast. Personalities can become famous through accusation alone. Public opinion can harden before facts are fully known. The technology's changed. The psychological pattern did not. We still reward spectacle. We still mistake confidence for credibility. We still sometimes prefer dramatic stories over difficult truths. That is why the Bundy trials remain historically important. They were not just early televised murder trials. They were a preview of a media age where image and reality would constantly compete. And yet, if we look deeper, the most enduring lessons are not about television at all. They are about human judgment. Bundy's outward normalcy challenged a comforting myth that danger always looks dangerous. Many people want evil to arrive with warning signs so obvious that no one could miss them. Real life is often less convenient. Harm can wear friendliness. Manipulation can sound respectful. Cruelty can hide behind discipline and charm. Awareness does not require paranoia. It requires humility. We do not always know people as well as we think we do. Another lesson lies in systems. The investigations that eventually connected Bundy across multiple states were difficult partly because information was fragmented. Different agencies held different pieces of the puzzle. Communication was slower, patterns were harder to see. Cases that seemed clearly linked in hindsight were once scattered across maps and filing cabinets. From those failures came improvements. Better databases, more coordinated investigations, greater attention to missing persons, behavioral analysis, cross-jurisdiction cooperation. Painful history can still teach useful lessons when institutions are willing to learn. There is also a lesson about law itself. Even defendants accused of terrible crimes receive rights. That principle can feel uncomfortable, especially in notorious cases, but legal fairness is not designed for the easy defendant. It is designed for everyone precisely because emotion can run hottest when accusations are severe. Bundy used those rights dramatically. He represented himself. He argued procedure. He challenged witnesses. He turned hearings into scenes people still discuss decades later. Yet the system continued moving through evidence, jury deliberation, verdict, and sentence. However imperfectly, the law aimed to judge facts rather than personality. That remains worth protecting. Then there is the lesson about storytelling. True crime can educate, it can warn. It can honor victims, expose investigative challenges, and help society understand patterns of violence. But it can also exploit suffering, reward notoriety, and transform tragedy into entertainment. The difference lies in how stories are told. Do they center victims as full human beings? Do they explain context responsibly? Do they avoid glamorizing offenders? Do they teach something useful? Do they remember that these were lives, not plot devices? The best storytelling does. The worst storytelling does not. Bundy's case continues to test that boundary. For every serious documentary, there is a shallow retelling. For every careful analysis, there is sensational packaging. For every thoughtful viewer, there is someone drawn only to shock value. That tension may never disappear, but audiences have power too. What we choose to watch, share, praise, and repeat shapes the culture around crime stories. If we reward depth, creators will produce more of it. If we reward spectacle alone, spectacle will multiply. And finally, there is the most personal lesson of all. The people most affected by these crimes were not television viewers, journalists, or historians. They were families, parents who lost daughters, friends who lost classmates. Communities that learned fear in familiar places, siblings who carried unanswered questions for years, children who grew up in the shadow of public tragedy. No courtroom performance should erase them. No famous name should overshadow them. No historical fascination should reduce them to background figures. When the cameras packed up and the headlines moved on, they remained. That is where the true weight of the story always lived. So how should Ted Bundy be remembered? Not as a dark celebrity, not as a genius, not as a myth, not as the star of his own courtroom drama. He should be remembered as a violent criminal whose crimes exposed weaknesses in systems, illusions in public judgment, and ethical challenges in media culture. His trials matter because they taught lessons about evidence, manipulation, justice, and the danger of confusing appearance with character. And the victims should be remembered as more than names attached to a notorious case. They were the center of the tragedy from the beginning, even when the world looked elsewhere. The courtroom is empty now, the microphones are gone, the verdicts are old history. The man at the defense table is long dead, but the questions raised by those trials still sit with us. How easily are we influenced by performance? How carefully do we examine evidence? Who receives our sympathy? Who receives our attention? What do we reward with fascination? And when the next dramatic case appears beneath modern lights, will we have learned enough to look past the show and see the truth? That answer, unlike the verdict in Ted Bundy's trial, is still being decided.